In the summer of 1914, Europe appeared stable on the surface, but beneath that veneer of diplomacy and peace, a complex network of alliances, rivalries, and mistrust had created a continent ready to explode. Europe's great powers, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Russia, France, and Britain, were all armed with powerful militaries, ambitious political goals, and rigid plans for conflict. Each nation had calculated that war could be managed or even avoided. Yet when a single crisis struck, the continent's interwoven alliances turned what could have been a localized incident into a global catastrophe. World War I did not erupt suddenly. It emerged as a chain reaction, a sequence of choices, assumptions, and obligations that fed upon each other until the continent spiraled beyond control. The spark came on June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, Bosnia-Herzegovina. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, travelled with his wife, Sophie, to inspect military exercises. Bosnia-Herzegovina had been annexed by Austria-Hungary only 6 years earlier, a move that angered Serbian nationalists who believed the province should belong to a greater Slavic state led by Serbia. Among these nationalists, the Black Hand secret society had prepared for months to assassinate the Archduke. Earlier that morning, a bomb attack failed. Later, in an almost accidental encounter, Gavrilo Princip found the Archduke's car stopped in front of him after it took a wrong turn. Princip fired 2 bullets, killing Franz Ferdinand and Sophie, an act that would trigger the largest war the world had ever seen. While the assassination was shocking, Europe did not immediately descend into chaos. Governments and markets initially treated it as a regional problem. Many assumed Austria-Hungary might punish Serbia diplomatically, perhaps with limited military action, but would not risk a wider conflict. In Vienna, however, the assassination was seen as an existential threat to the empire. Austria-Hungary feared that allowing Serbia to act with impunity would inspire uprisings among its own Slavic populations, potentially destabilizing the empire from within. For the Austro-Hungarian leadership, inaction was not an option. Yet Austria-Hungary did not move alone. Before taking any irreversible step, it turned to its strongest ally, Germany. The Austrians sought reassurance. If a confrontation with Serbia escalated into a war involving Russia, would Germany stand by them? German leaders, worried about their strategic position and eager to maintain their alliance, offered a blank check, an unconditional promise of support, effectively giving Austria-Hungary the green light to act. With Berlin's assurance, Vienna delivered an ultimatum to Serbia on July 23rd. The ultimatum was extraordinarily strict, demanding Serbia allow Austrian officials to participate in internal investigations on its territory and suppress anti-Austrian propaganda. The terms were intentionally designed to be nearly impossible to accept without compromising sovereignty. Serbia, aware of its military inferiority, accepted most demands but rejected the intrusion into its judicial and administrative independence. Austria-Hungary viewed this as insufficient. On July 28th, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Artillery soon opened fire on Belgrade, marking the beginning of a localized conflict. But the alliances Europe had developed over decades now came into play, rapidly widening the war. Russia, identifying itself as the protector of Slavic nations, could not ignore the threat to Serbia. Its leaders feared that a decisive Austro-Hungarian victory would undermine Russian influence in the Balkans and embolden Austria-Hungary against other Slavic populations under its control. After deliberation, Russia ordered a partial mobilization on July 29th, and then full mobilization on July 30th. In the military mindset of the era, mobilization was understood as preparation for imminent war. Once troops were on the move, plans were difficult to reverse. Germany, anticipating a potential two-front war with Russia in the east and France in the west, now faced a strategic dilemma. Germany's war plan, known as the Schlieffen Plan, required a rapid defeat of France before Russian forces could fully mobilize. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. 2 days later, after France refused to remain neutral, Germany declared war on France. To execute the plan, German troops marched through neutral Belgium, violating international treaties guaranteeing Belgian sovereignty. This act forced Britain, a guarantor of Belgium's neutrality, to intervene. On August 4th, Britain issued an ultimatum demanding Germany withdraw. Germany refused, and Britain declared war. Within a single week, what began as a regional crisis had escalated into a continental war. By the end of August, the conflict was global, drawing in colonies and distant territories. What makes this chain reaction so extraordinary is that nearly every nation acted under the belief that it was defending itself. Austria-Hungary sought to preserve its empire. Serbia sought to maintain independence. Russia sought to protect a fellow Slavic nation. Germany sought to prevent encirclement. France acted to honor alliances. Britain acted to uphold international law. Each decision, rational in isolation, contributed to an unstoppable momentum toward mass conflict. The rigid military timetables of the era intensified the escalation. Once mobilization began, it could not easily be reversed. Rail networks, troop schedules, and logistical planning meant that delaying or cancelling mobilization was nearly impossible without chaos or perceived dishonor. Diplomacy struggled to keep pace with military realities, and efforts to mediate were increasingly overtaken by momentum. By the time the first soldiers crossed borders in August 1914, the war had already become inevitable. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Millions of men mobilized across Europe, armies clashed along long fronts, and new technologies of war, artillery, machine guns, chemical weapons, turned battlefields into killing grounds on an unprecedented scale. By the end of 1914, Europe was entrenched in a conflict whose magnitude few had anticipated. Entire empires, the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, and eventually German, would be shaken to their foundations. Economies were redirected toward war production, societies were transformed, and political landscapes would never return to their pre-1914 state. World War I serves as a stark example of how interlocking systems, alliances, assumptions, and rigid planning can turn a localized crisis into a global catastrophe. It was not caused by a single person or a single event, but by a cascade of decisions in which each choice made the next one harder to avoid. In 1914, Europe stumbled into war not because leaders wanted destruction, but because the mechanisms of power, honor, and fear created a chain reaction with consequences far beyond what anyone could have predicted. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand was the spark, but the fuel was decades of nationalism, militarization, diplomatic alliances, and rigid strategic planning. Once the first domino fell, there was no way to stop the sequence. The world had become a tightly interconnected system where small events could trigger massive outcomes, a lesson painfully clear as millions of lives were lost and Europe was forever transformed. World War I was the product of human ambition, miscalculation, and fear, an example of how systems, once set in motion, can escape control. It remains a cautionary tale about how alliances and rigid structures can escalate crises beyond comprehension, and how history often moves faster than diplomacy can respond.